Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, and thank you for joining us at Think Tent this afternoon. Our topic today is, have we turned our backs on the idea of success? Profit is a dirty word. The idea that business is there to sort of rip people off, and greedflation here in the media give the distinct impression that the private sector are the bad guys. And what are Conservatives in the big and small C sense doing to fight back against that, and indeed stick up for the private sector and the productivity enhancing sector? So we're going to have quite a lot to unpick and discuss during the course of this session. So I'm joined by a great panel, in fact. Ranil Jayawardena MP, Lance Foreman, entrepreneur, and Emily Fielder from the Adam Smith Institute, Paul Barnes from the Association of International Retail, and Dr. Azim Ibrahim, who's now based in DC, if I'm correct in saying so, Azim. So without further ado, we'll get cracking. Ranil, why don't we give the floor to you first? Why can't we talk about success more without feeling ashamed about it?
Well, I think we can talk about it. I think we must. But part of the problem is that across the Western world as a whole, I don't think this is a uniquely British thing, we just haven't seen enough conservatism in action, full stop. We're effectively living in a social democracy. Sort of social democratic system has been baked in for the last 25 years, and we don't seem to be able to escape from that orbit. And if anything was true about Brexit, I think it was about freedom. I think it was about people having the freedom to live their own lives again as they wish, to spend their own money as they want, because that's what people instinctively have always done over many generations. It's the aberration of the last 25 years that we must act against. And part of the problem has been that the agenda has been captured by centrists, by statists, and as a result we have been suffering. And I think that's the real problem here. Not that we can't talk about success, not that we must be ashamed of success, but that we've just not had enough of it. The higher taxes that we've faced consistently have led to a stagnating economy. The growing size and reach of the state has removed the innovation that we need to see, and the increased levels of regulation and the telling people how to live their lives has got to stop. And it's, I think, and indeed the function of not wanting to talk about success, or indeed not having enough success to talk about, is a function of 25 years of consensus. And it's that consensus, I think, that we need to challenge and talk about. It's that consensus that I think we need to shatter if we're to make Britain grow again in the years ahead. Big government is definitely the problem, not the solution. And part of how we change this, I think, part of how we change the narrative is to overhaul the British state itself, to overhaul the structure of the British state itself. And that's what people voted for when they voted to take back control from Brussels bureaucrats, not to then pass them to Whitehall bureaucrats. We need to deliver a smaller, more accountable, more nimble government that really does trust people to control their own lives again. And to do that, and to make sure that we do have success to talk about, I think we need to make the case once again for free market economics, and be honest that it's businesses that create wealth in this country that pay for everything else that we rely on. And we mustn't ever accept that British people should be worse off than their American cousins, over £9,000 worse off than their American cousins. So our Brexit freedoms really must be seized now. And that's going to make things that's going to make life easier and better for the British public, and that's going to give them the success that I believe the British public does want to talk about in the years ahead.
Thank you, Ranil. And obviously, those who know the work of the TPA wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that I agree with you on the idea of bringing down the size of the state and the scope of the state as well, just as crucially. But on the premise of the question itself, do you feel, maybe as a Conservative MP, that you are attacked when you go on the media and you talk about success and profit and all of this kind of stuff, or are we sort of misguided in even talking about this question to start with?
No, I think there's a natural discourse in any country, and it's perfectly right and proper for the media to challenge politicians. I believe in that freedom. The point is that not enough people have benefited from the success that I think we need to see, that then makes people sceptical about it. Why is it that so many young people can't get onto the property ladder, for example? The reason is we've not built enough homes. So then when people talk about success and see the big bonuses being paid to house builders and so on, they go, well, that's why I can't buy a home. Actually, the real reason is that the British state and the bureaucracy of the British state and the planning system means that it's so bunged up that no one, bar that a few house builders, can ever build homes anywhere in our country. Certainly, we can't seem to build anything in our cities where we get the biggest growth opportunities. So I think it's just people don't feel enough connection to success. That's the problem. And I don't think there's anything wrong with people challenging us on how we can do better.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll pass straight over to a resilient Lance Foreman who's arrived here with an injury, but is still bravely going to make the case.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of almost a cultural problem. I don't think the Tories have turned their back on success. I think the country has turned its back on success. And the sad thing for me is that the Tories have done nothing to stop the slide away from that. Until Liz Truss, of course, that didn't last very long. Perhaps we've seen a few glimmers of light at the end of the tunnel with some of the recent statements from Rishi. It'll probably turn out to be an oncoming train, but not the HS2, of course. But think back. I do. When I was at school, we used to have sports day, and it was a big deal to win. Winning a race was like quite a big deal. You fast forward to my kids' generation, and it wasn't about winning, it was about taking part that was important. And I think that is a problem, because winning is not just about incentive and success and in business, obviously, winning is about innovating and everything else. But losing is also really important. You learn more from losing at something than you do from winning. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons why so many of our children have so much anxiety nowadays is because they never lost anything and they don't know how to deal with failure. And actually, as I say, you learn from failure very early on. My parents were keen that I didn't pass my driving test first time round because they thought I'd be a much better driver if I failed. I did actually pass, and I've recently been banned from driving. So they were right.
Point, yeah.
But in business, this whole idea of trying to protect people and regulation has gone way, way too far. And it is done with the best of intentions, but it suffocates growth. And the number one reason why family businesses, which account for the vast majority of businesses in the UK, the number one reason why they pack up is not because, there's no next generation or they can't make a profit. It's because they just come into work one day and they say, you know what, I cannot deal with the red tape anymore. It's just so burdensome and so frustrating, they give up. In our own business, I'm the fourth generation in my business, but my dad was at that point 35, 40 years ago. He was thinking, how much longer do I have to, because we just entered the EU at that stage. The environmental health authorities were forcing him to change all his beautifully tiled factory floor into a resin floor because there might be bacteria that grows in the grouting of the tile. So you weren't allowed to have tiled factory floors. Everybody had to move to resin. After a few years, they found that the resin wasn't really as robust. Water would get underneath. These things would crack up, and it, in fact, it became a much bigger health problem than the potential with the grouting. The same with the walls. They said, oh no, you can't have tiled walls. You've got to have these sandwich panels. They were filled with polystyrene. We had a fire a few years later. The whole thing just burnt like, appallingly because it was just the wrong decision. So then we were told, and we were told by the authorities and by the insurers, you have to have rock wool filled panels, which we did. 10 years later, they've come back to us and said, oh, actually, they're no good. We're going to double your insurance premiums because you've got these rock wool panels. The problem with all these regulations, they might be done with the best of intentions, but often they just get in the way and they're frustrating. And it's become a racket. I could talk about that. The whole regulation industry has become a racket. People are, every regulator tries to do better than the next regulator. It just makes business tougher and tougher. So for me, the key thing that we need to do is we need to be prepared to take some risks in life. And I believe passionately that that's what the British people were doing when they voted for Brexit. They were told by every politician, or most of them anyway, do not vote for this, it'll be a disaster for our country, and they were prepared to take a risk and do it. Sadly, the political class has not seized the opportunity that Brexit's provided. We should be scrapping regulations, not just EU regulations, all sorts of regulations. Obviously, there needs to be some level of protection, but there's far too much at this stage. And then finally, removing regulation is half of it. You also need to incentivize success. We need lower taxes. You need to incentivize too. And if we go back to our sports day scenario, imagine if the cup or the prize that the winner wins is shared out amongst all the losers and even the people that couldn't be bothered to take part in the race. Where's the incentive? So low tax deregulation is not complicated. Just those two things would be a great start.
Remembering who's hosting this tent, what's more important, regulation or tax?
Equally important. I mean, deregulation is half of it. You need to move those obstructions, and you need to reduce taxes to incentivize people to want to go faster and and grow. And everything. We said it. It all comes down to business. It's business that creates growth, it's business that creates wealth, it's business that creates jobs, it's ultimately business that pays every single tax. Yes. Because if businesses don't employ people, people don't earn income with which to buy things, to pay VAT, to pay every other tax. Everything comes back ultimately to business. You really need business to flourish. And at the moment, the Tories, say that they used to be the party of low tax. They used to be the party of small business. And most small business people I speak to now just don't feel it. They're not feeling the love. We need that love.
Yeah, and I suppose lots of small business supporters of the TPA say regulation is a tax anyway, in terms of what it costs them of money and time and labour.
Absolutely, it's more, in many respects, it's more burdensome than tax because you pay it whether you're profitable or you're unprofitable. Corporation tax you only pay when you're profitable. So there are so many. I reckon in my own business, we employ, I'd say almost 10% of our employment cost is dealing with regulations that are completely and utterly pointless. I could literally write a book about this. And I know people joke about regulation. You have this awful broadcaster, James O'Brien in LBC, that tells the callers, name me a regulation. And they phone in, they name one, and he mocks them and jokes. And individually, they all do seem very, very petty. But when you face a mountain of these tiny little things every single day that only get tougher and tougher and tougher because the enforcers want to enforce more and more, it just becomes increasingly challenging and burdensome. And, business, it's just very, very hard to run a business nowadays. Very hard.
Yeah, perhaps he doesn't find them so challenging because he doesn't actually run a business.
That's true.
Let's hand straight over to Emily.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. So I'd actually really like to start by talking about the main slogan for this party conference, which I believe is long-term decisions for a brighter future. I'd like to start by asking the audience a question, if that's okay. I'd like you to raise your hand if you think that the Tories haven't given up and are focusing on the long-term problems this country faces. One. Okay, well, I think that's a general feeling across the country, right? So I think there was this poll by Lord Ashcroft quite recently that showed that 7 in 10 people think that Britain is broken. And if you want a really clear example of how the Conservative Party is focusing, I think, on short-term problems at the moment, you can just look at the sort of things they're announcing at party conference, right? What is it? It's banning mobile phones in schools. It's scrapping investment and infrastructure. It's what the Prime Minister might announce tomorrow, which is basically getting rid of smoking. So I'd really like to go into how this general state of inertia amongst not just the Conservatives, I think a lot of the whole political class, all politicians, has really manifested itself and what the cause is. Hopefully later on we can talk about the solutions so we don't all leave feeling very pessimistic. So to start with, it's firstly manifested itself by making us all feel poorer, because we are poorer. And Ranil touched on this earlier about how much richer America is. I was actually in America last month, touring around the country with some friends, and it really kind of hit home for me, like how much more peers who are on the same level of employment or jobs were being paid than me, how much cheaper lots of things seemed, how much better the quality of life was. And just to put some stats on it, I think America is 39% richer than we are. They could stop working on the 22nd of September and still be richer than us. Their starting salaries are twice what ours is, and their energy costs are considerably lower. The reason for us feeling poorer are two things, and they interlink. So the first thing is stagnant wage growth, which we've had for 2 decades, and productivity, which has been at an all-time low, and these things are connected. This is also connected to our tax system, which is just a complete mess, right? So we often talk about those who are on £125,000 a year or over, where the marginal tax rate hits about 47%, I think. But those earning under that can also face a higher rate too, and that's partly to do with once you reach £100,000 a year, personal allowance goes, as does government childcare schemes. You could also talk about the student loans, which is just essentially a graduate tax. That adds an extra 9% of marginal tax rate, and that means the top marginal tax rate of 68% becomes 77%. Let that sink in, 77%. At the Adam Smith Institute, we often track up how much taxes are going up through Tax Freedom Day. So this year, Tax Freedom Day fell on the 18th of June, which is the highest since records began. You can also talk about inflation. So the Prime Minister is quite right to say that inflation is a tax, and the reason that is partly because of fiscal drag. So inflation means that we're all being dragged into higher tax brackets. The other reason why we feel poorer is because everything is just more expensive, right? So this is particularly felt in housing. So just to use another statistic, which is quite helpful to illustrate this, in the 80s and 90s, it took the average first-time buyer of 30 years old 3 years to save for a deposit. Now it takes 20. So why is this? I think that the simple answer is short-termism, and partly that's to do with the median voting age in 2019 being 55. Another way we really feel short-termism in this country is government spending. So I recently reread a really good article by Kate Andrews of The Spectator, and she pointed out that successive governments have been ring-fencing spending for very politically sensitive areas. They've not been reforming them, just spending more money on it, rather than making capital investment in crumbling infrastructure, and we've seen this recently in the schools crumbling crisis. And this is because the effects wouldn't be felt for decades, so they just weren't too worried about it. They thought, another government can pick up that problem later. And I think the final way that we sort of feel a sense of giving up is because a lot of politicians of all stripes, not all of them, obviously we have people like Ranil, our patrons, lots of other great MPs that are making the case, but generally they don't feel that prepared anymore to make the case for free markets and capitalism. And the one example that I always use is the windfall tax, or the temporary energy profits levy, right? So just coming at, from my job from a communications perspective, we had this windfall tax. Keir Starmer said it didn't go far enough. And what the Prime Minister should have said was, look, not great, but we have to do it right now because of how the economy is. But, generally, we think windfall taxes are bad for business investment, and here's why. But rather than saying that, he just said, oh, actually, this is one of the best windfall taxes in the G7 or the OECD. So rather than making the case that windfall taxes are bad, he just said, actually, it's a good thing, and this is why we've put it so high. The positive news, as we'll hopefully go into, is that there are solutions to all the problems that this country is facing. And we at the Adam Smith Institute and lots of commentators across the board have been making the case for them over and over again. So there isn't a need to give up. The problem is the politics and the inertia, and that is what I think is giving a sense of giving up.
Thank you, Emily. Do you feel there's a sort of cultural aspect to this as well? The old saying of politics being downstream from culture. Is there sort of a cultural problem where we think success is, brash and horrible? What is really the problem with celebrating success in the UK?
I'm not really sure it's much of a cultural problem. I think Ranil touched on this earlier. I think the problem is it's very hard to make the case for capitalism at the moment because lots of people don't feel they have a stake in capitalism anymore. I think what we have now in this country is more corporatism, so that's captured by the state or really big businesses rather than capitalism. So if I was to tell anyone to watch anything, there's a really good documentary called Margaret Thatcher, Death of a Revolutionary, and it really touches on how Margaret Thatcher made success and capitalism a good thing because she gave people a stake in the economics of this country. So that's things like people could buy shares in previous monopolies and people could buy their own homes. So I think actually making capitalism work for people is more important.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go straight over to Paul.
Thank you. I think the question is, do the Tory government still support success? I think what I'm seeing missing as a businessman and representing a number of big retail businesses, hotel businesses and others in the UK, is just a lack of hunger for success. When we left the European Union, there were many opportunities, we were told, for businesses to benefit from that. And there was one opportunity that was absolutely huge, which was that Britain could become the only country in Europe that could offer tax-free shopping to the whole of Western Europe, the whole of the European Union. Suddenly, we had 450 million people sitting on our doorstep who got a quick flight over to any of our regional airports, come to London on Eurostar, do their tax-free shopping, 20% off. Perfect. We would be the place to go to. Massive new industry for tourism, massive new sector. And international tourism is massive for this country. We earned £28 billion from it back in 2019. It's going to be up to 50 billion by 2030. It's a massive growth industry, and it's a potentially even bigger growth industry, because when you think, high tech, if you go down the AI route, what we're talking about is massive new creation of wealth worldwide, but also massive new amount of leisure, because AI is going to be doing lots of those jobs for you. If you put lots of wealth and lots of free time together, you get international travel, because that's what's going to happen. And Britain could have been the place in the world to come for international travel. We're already in the top 10. But instead of moving us over and saying, yeah, come on, you can come and shop tax-free in Europe, they said nobody can shop tax-free in the UK. Nobody. Which means suddenly that we're now the only country in Europe that doesn't offer tax-free shopping. And the government says, the Treasury say, it won't make any difference. Same people, put 20% up on the cost of things and people will still come. Of course they will. Of course they don't. All the data is now showing that while Britain, there's a big bounce back of international travel post-pandemic, Britain is now, for American tourists, back to the same level of spending as it was in 2019. That's fantastic. But in France, it's 3 times the amount. In Italy, it's 2.5 times the amount. In Spain, it's 3 times the amount. The huge amount of pent-up demand for spending on international travel has gone. We should have got all of that and all those millions of people from Europe. And the thing to add to that is that the flip side of the coin is that since we left the European Union, British people can now shop tax-free in the EU. The Treasury said that won't make any difference, because they told us, don't forget, it won't make any difference to behaviour if you offer 20% off. This year, 1 million British people will be spending £1 billion that they would have been spending in British high streets in Paris, in Milan and Madrid, because they get tax-free shopping. If we do the numbers, our 60 million people are spending 1 billion. The 450 million Europeans would have been spending about £6 billion here in the UK at no cost to the government, no hard work, and it happened, it's not like investing in infrastructure where it happens, you invest in infrastructure, you might see it in 10, 15 years' time. The moment the EU lifted tax-free shopping, they got £1 billion boost in year 1. Why didn't we do that? We had the opportunity. We could have been the top country. That was a real solid Brexit bonus. And the government gave it to the French. I just don't feel there's a hunger there.
Thank you, Paul. And that was a powerful case with lots of numbers that all sound great, but perhaps there's a communications challenge, as Emily was saying. I mean, tiny violins for rich people going shopping, right? I suppose that's the premise of this entire debate. Why can't we sort of say that's okay? Success is a good thing.
You're absolutely right. I mean, yes, absolutely. It's been portrayed as by the Treasury, oh, this is tax break for rich people. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. If that's okay if they lived in Britain, so why give them tax breaks when they have to pay their money and they pay their tax? But the answer is, if you don't give them that tax break, they just don't spend anything in Britain. Because don't forget, only 10% of everything they spend is tax-free shopping. The other 90% they pay VAT on. So long as they say, well, actually, do you know what? I'm not going to go to London, I'll go to Paris, we lose everything they would have spent, the other 90% they would have spent where we've got VAT. So yes, of course, in tax-free shopping, they get a tax break, just like they do in every European country and every major country around the world, because that's how the international tax system works. It's just that in Britain now they don't. So they just say, well, I'm not coming to Britain then. And we lose out on all that amount. It's just too simplistic, and it's amazing that Treasury go down that route of saying, oh, well, it's giving money back to rich people. Yeah, but it actually earns a huge amount of additional money for the country, which is jobs, which is businesses throughout the country. You know, you've seen Mulberry, you know, one of our great British brands, just closed its stores in London. No point of doing it anymore. Burberry saying, we're losing money in Britain now, we're making much more money in France. The money's still being spent, it's just not being spent in Britain.
Okay, thank you very much. Azim, perhaps a view from across the pond.
Thanks so much, John. Now, you may be wondering why a professor of the US Army War College is on this panel. So one of my jobs is to look at long-term trends. So I advise the Department of Defence on current and emerging security threats and trends. But before I moved to the United States, I was actually an entrepreneur in the UK. I employed over 100 people in multiple businesses. I won a number of awards, and I've been back for the last couple of years in Scotland to my home city where I'm based. And one of the things I've noticed in the United Kingdom, I can make quite a fair comparison between the places. We hear a lot of politicians today talking about how things are going really well. After all, the United Kingdom is one of the biggest economies in the world. We're the 6th largest economy, valued at about $3.2 trillion. And that may sound very significant, but the reality is, if you look at the numbers a little bit deeper, the OECD indicates that the UK is actually one of the most geographically unequal economies in the world. Our economy is essentially very, very London-centric. The majority of our economy is based on service and financial services and banking. Now, one of the things I've noticed having come back to the UK after spending a decade in the United Kingdom is how the political debate has changed. The political debate has actually moved the conversation. We went from promoting growth, enterprise, businesses. Now, almost the debate on all sides of the political spectrum seems to be dominated by public services. The only thing that gets headlines and gets points is increasing spending. And you see this in all political parties as we enter party season, increasing spending on X, increasing spending on Y, with very little consideration in terms of where this money is actually coming from. There just doesn't seem to be enough focus on small and medium enterprises. Governments don't create jobs themselves, neither do the major multinationals. It's actually the small and medium enterprises, it's actually the entrepreneurs. And in the United Kingdom, it seems that profit, enterprise, and private businesses have just become dirty words. You know, everything public is very good, everything private is bad, and you can see this in the media narrative as well. Oh, look, the Tories, they're just trying to privatise the NHS. It's like a really bad thing, and we must keep it within the public hands. And you see this also even during the COVID pandemic. If you remember, self-employed people were just not taken into consideration when all the bailouts and everything else were done. Self-employed people were just left out the equation. And in my country, in Scotland, the situation is even worse. 21.9% people in Scotland are now working for the public sector. The biggest employer in Scotland is the local government. And the SNP are able to do this because there is no consequence, and that's a completely different debate in terms of actually the devolution settlement. You know, they can afford to make populist positions without any consequence. You know, if you were running a business, for example, and if you were running a restaurant and I told you you're going to get £50 million every year, you know, how well do you think you'll run that business? That's essentially what the SNP are doing. You know, they went from, if you remember in the referendum, there's going to be an oil bonanza. It's our Scotland's oil, to now we need to cut all oil exploration at all. And there's going to be no financial consequences for them simply because, you know, they'll still keep getting the money. Now, the situation in the United Kingdom, there's actually huge opportunity in a post-Brexit Britain. And I emphasise this very clearly. In 2016, there was a report done by the OECD called Going for Growth, and it said that the most significant trend over the next 40 years, the most significant global economic trend over the next 40 years is going to be the decline of Europe. In 1980, Europe accounted for 30% of the global economy, almost 1/3. By 2020, it went down to 16%, and by 2050, it went down to 9%. Europe is in decline. In 40 years, there's only going to be 3 major economic centres of power: the United States, China, and India. With us being outside Europe actually offers huge opportunity. Europe does not have a single research university in the top 10 in the world, whereas the United Kingdom has multiple universities, dozens in the top 100. When it comes to innovation, patents, technology, research, the United Kingdom is a global leader. But what we have been very poor at doing is actually translating that research into commercial innovation. For example, this whole debate is going on, turn on your TVs now, about HS2. Wherever you stand on that, where was this invented, the maglev? This was actually invented in this city by Professor Eric Braithwaite in 1962. He invented what they call the electric river, the first maglev train. Every country commercialised it, the United Kingdom didn't. We simply are not able to commercialise the innovation that we have developed. Same thing goes for graphene, also discovered in this city. It was worth 2 Nobel Prizes. How have we commercialised this? Other countries are militarising it and commercialising it, and we are still left behind. This is where, in post-Brexit Britain, there is huge opportunity to deregulate our financial markets, to deregulate innovation, AI, and all other future technologies. Goldman Sachs estimates that AI is going to be worth over $50 trillion, is going to be woven through every single segment of the global economy. This is where the UK can actually take a lead if we have the ability to understand the direction of travel in these technologies.
All right, thank you very much. I just wanted to quickly ask you, the America in my head is very much, sleeves up, everybody celebrates success, and, you go bankrupt, and that's just part of the story. It's not a big deal. You sort of dust yourself off and go again. Is that still true, or is the problem that we're discussing today about celebrating success a Western one or a UK-specific one?
No, that's a great question. In Silicon Valley, what do they call, it's a very famous saying, in Silicon Valley, what do they call a failed entrepreneur? They called him experienced. Unless you have gone through the failure of bankruptcy and being wiped out and learnt the lessons, nobody's going to invest in you because you simply don't know how to handle the situation when things get rocky. And this is the difference. In the United States as well, it's just a cultural difference. Like you see here in the UK, in the US, even in your neighbourhood, if there's potholes in the street, the neighbourhood would get together and have a potluck dinner. They'll have a raffle, they'll raise some money, and they get the potholes fixed. Here in the UK, everybody looks to government. The local government has to come and fix it. Nobody will take the initiative. It's just a very different culture and atmosphere. And as I mentioned, in the UK, it's just become a dirty word. If you're successful, you must have got there by cheating. You're a tax cheat. If you own a single coffee shop, you and your partner own a single coffee shop, well done, good for you. If you own 10, if you own 100, oh, how did you manage that? You're not paying your tax. You're just a fat cat. You're not paying your tax, you're just a fat cat, you're mistreating your workers. Why don't you spread the wealth amongst your workers? The whole idea of success is just looked down upon in the UK in comparison. If that was somebody in the US, they'd be on Oprah. Somebody that's gone from the council estate, from social housing, that's become a billionaire. They'll be celebrated. Here it's the polar opposite.
So definitely not a Western problem then, very much a UK one. Okay, really interesting and wide-ranging comments there. We're going to open it out to the floor, so let's get some roving mics. There's a lady just down at the front. One's on the way.
Thank you. I'm interested in what you said about regulation. I just had an email from a friend of mine who's a self-employed architect, and he said he put in an application, planning application, for a 2-bed self-built house to South Cambridgeshire Council. And he's had to go through 2 tree surveys, 2 tree protection and management plans, 2 biodiversity surveys, 2 biodiversity management plans, 2 bat surveys, 1 dimension survey, 2 impact assessments, 4 designs, 8 application forms, 2 proofs of evidence, 2 appeal additional information statements, 2 appeal forms, and 2 appeal site visits. And he has just had permission granted to build this house. The first application went in 2017. Now, are these regulations EU regulations, or are they imposed by the UK?
Well, he's got more energy than me if he got the planning done, because just listening to that was pretty difficult. Ranul, why don't you go?
Yeah, I mean, so these are now British regulations. There is not a single one of those things that we could not remove today if we wanted to. Now, I mean, without knowing the particular case and being self-built, it may well be a site that local councils didn't want for whatever reason. But the idea that we have to have reams and reams of paperwork to build a house is absurd. My house was built in 1949, and a sheet of paper about this big is all that gave the person who built the house the permission to build it. And it literally said, you have permission, Basingstoke District Council, you have the permission to build a house at Ringsall Nurseries, signed Town Clerk. That was it. And now, as you say, there are reams and reams of paper required, not only in the application, but in the conditions that are attached to building a house. This is why we don't build any houses anymore. And the way we can get housing going, particularly in our cities, I think, is getting house building zones granted. And the way of doing that isn't top-down mandatory targets. I don't think the state needs to do that. What we actually need to do is incentivise people and communities and councils to say, we want to grow our area. And the way we do that, unsurprisingly, in my view, is to cut their taxes. If we change the dialogue between you will face more traffic on your roads, so we'll build a bit of an extension to the road. You will need more places in your school, so we'll build an extension in the school. If we changed it from that being the dynamic and that being the debate with the developers to, you are going to save £10,000 over the next 10 years because we know that the proceeds of this growth will mean that we can afford to cut your council tax by £1,000 every year, I think that fundamentally changes the debate. Those are the sorts of policies that we need to see, and it's entirely in our gift now that we've left the European Union.
Lance.
I'm completely sympathetic to that situation because I had a very similar situation myself. We had a little sliver of land adjacent to our factory, and the area was becoming quite residential. So I thought, well, interesting, I'll see if I can come up with an interesting design for that slice of land. I employed some architects. And again, we had to spend an absolute fortune going through all these various reports, the archaeological reports and so on and so forth. And in the end, it went to planning committee and they said, well, and it was only literally 10 apartments, 10-storey, one flat per floor. Eventually they came back and they said, well, no, they think it's going to obstruct the view of a chimney behind. If we can make it 8 stories, then they'll give us permission. But of course, it wouldn't never work commercially at 8 stories. It wouldn't be profitable. So why would I do it? And indeed, I didn't do it. So, the regulations have gone far too far. But I think another problem which we haven't really talked about with regulation, and this is right across the board, not just housing, but housing is a perfect example, is that regulation has literally crowded out small producers or contractors or whatever, and you've had a cartelisation of so many industries. In my own industry, in the salmon industry, you've got about half a dozen producers that can now control the entire global supply of salmon. In housing, house building, there are so few small house builders left. You've just got, a small number of these huge firms. They get all permissions, they control the market, and you just don't have enough competition. We need to, as I said earlier on, we just need to break down the regulations and give people a chance to actually do something, because people want to do, inherently, I think our instincts are to be positive and to build and to grow and to succeed, but we're just being stifled at every turn.
Emily, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Yes. Well, I think I want to make 3 quick points about this. Firstly, that our terrible planning system is not just bad for house building, it's bad for business and it's bad for the hospitality sector in particular. The second point I'd like to make is I absolutely agree with Ranul. We have to incentivise communities and councils to want more buildings in their area, and that can either look like giving cash to people or cutting taxes. And I think that should go not just for housing, but for other infrastructure. So one thing we recommend at the Adam Smith Institute is if you build a nuclear power station, wind turbines, a solar farm near a community, then they will get money off their energy bills. The third point I'd like to make is I think we've seen recently in public debate, and this is a point about inertia again, just how difficult it seems to be to scrap these regulations. So the most obvious example is this recent, the Prime Minister decided that he was going to scrap the neutrality rule, which he was absolutely right to do so. Unfortunately, the Labour Party decided out of political expediency that it wasn't going to support it, and then it got blocked in the Lords. So I think that is a real problem, that we can talk about all the regulations that we want to scrap, but as we've seen, it's very hard to scrap them.
I saw a lot of hands shoot up, so we'll carry on going. We've got two gentlemen at the back. Let's take them both at the same time, if possible, Ben.
Hi there. Thanks very much. I love low regulation.
Sorry, just to introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name's Angelo Basu from North and West Leeds Federation. I love low regulation. I love low tax. That's why I'm in here. But I think there's a lot of pieties being said, particularly from politicians who themselves have relied on or increased regulation. And I think we need to be honest here. I don't want to pick on you particularly, Mr. Jabardina, but you talked about here's one page to get planning for my house. But you've campaigned against housing being built in your constituency because it hadn't gone through the right process or that people didn't want it. You've, as a minister, been against making it possible to put up solar farms. Let's be honest here. If we want to have low regulation, you can't also go for being NIMBY about other things. So which is it? Come on.
I'll have to.
That's a direct question to Ranald, which we'll let him answer afterwards. If we can just take the next one.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rob Harris from Leeds North West. I'm a private tax senior manager at a Big Four firm. So basically, if you're paying too much tax, you should change your tax advisor. Is my first comment. But the more serious one is what we saw last year was Liz Truss went for growth. Growth or bust was what she said, and the market said, no, we can't have it. So the honest answer is if we want to get tax down, we've got to get spending down, as well as having a plan for growth as well. It can't just be one or the other. So we're talking about cutting taxes. Where do we think the spending really needs to come from? Because I look at it, I'm a high rate taxpayer. If you take your employer's national insurance into account as well, in the figures you gave, it's actually even higher. Your actual effective rate of tax, if you've got a student load, if you get into the 100 to 120, it's over 80%, which is insane. So, but you've then got state pensions, which are costing £100 billion a year, projected to be £200 billion by 2040, I think it was. Where's this money going to come from if we cut the taxes when we've got spending like that? Do we need to scrap the state pension? I know we're not going to, but this is what I'm getting at. We can't cut taxes.
Yeah, I understand.
That's why I'm asking, where would you cut to fund the tax cuts?
Absolutely understand the premise of the question. So, Ranald, why don't you pick up that first
Yeah,
one?
can I deal with the first one? So, first of all, I think the record will show so that actually I've always deferred to local councillors in deciding local planning applications, and I don't actually comment on housing applications. Why elect local councillors if you're going to have an MP stepping in the whole time? So that's always been my policy. And I say that as someone who used to be a former councillor, and I always believe that actually it should be for local councillors to do that. If we want MPs to become super councillors, then we might as well scrap local government. I don't think that's desirable. So on that point, I'm sorry, I disagree with you, and I think the record is very clear on that. But on solar farms, absolutely, I do believe that's a very poor use of good quality agricultural land across this country, and government should step in where there is failure. I don't believe in no regulation. I believe in low regulation, and there is a very bad policy right now, particularly with some solar farm developers gaming a system, and this is part of the problem with regulation, building 49 megawatts of solar farm capability in certain places so that it doesn't get taken account of as part of the national planning rules, which require it to be over 50 megawatts. Now, I can get into the real specifics on this. I won't, because there's plenty of other stuff to discuss. But I do think it's very short-sighted to build solar farms, which ultimately, 25 years' time, the government will end up paying for the decommissioning of, because of all these companies that have been set up, ring-fenced SPVs for each site, which will end up being liquidated, and suddenly, what are we going to do with this junk? out in our countryside, where it's going to be, once again, the government has to clean it up. I think it's very short-sighted to go for those sorts of policies when we're not even building, if we do want to have solar in this country, and it's an if we do want to have solar in this country, why aren't we building it on the roofs of warehouses, where it's a perfectly good site that is currently redundant? Anyway, thanks, John.
No problem at all. Randall, why don't we just stay with you for a second to address some of Rob's point about bringing down spending if we want to cut taxes. Obviously, there's a significant pressure on the public finances from pensions, welfare and healthcare. The OBR forecasts are quite alarming in that regard. Where else we make the sort of necessary spending reductions to bring tax down?
So, look, one of the failings, and let's be honest, it was a failing of last year, was not, I agree with you, not to set out, not only spending reductions, but also the plan for growth. We set out the tax cuts, we didn't have either of the other two pillars. It does actually reassure me that once the plan for growth was published after the event, a lot of people said, actually, this is really good stuff, and we need to do this, and we need to actually identify the opportunities to grow our economy. At the same time, you're absolutely right that when we're spending 46% of our GDP in the public sector, that is too high, and that has grown under our watch. Part of that is debt interest as a result of having spent a huge amount of money, quite understandably, during COVID, but a lot of that isn't. And we must be honest about that. As for specifics, I'm not going to invent stuff off the top of my head, but I do think our welfare budget as a whole is a problem. I do think that hardworking taxpayers across this country do get frustrated when they're paying in for a lot of stuff that allows some people to choose, oh, I'm going to work part-time. Oh, I'm going to work only this many hours because that's how I optimize my benefits paycheck at the end of the month through universal credit. That's not what it was intended to do. It's never been the intention of any benefit system in this country, or I suspect anywhere in the world, bar, isn't it one of the Nordic countries there's a UBI thing in Norway? But, that's not what I think the system's set up for. And I do think we need to be tougher on that. I'm pleased to see that the government wants to be, and of course the proof of the pudding is in the eating. On pensions, I think there is of course a live debate. David Frost was talking yesterday about raising the age for the state pension. I certainly don't think it should be abolished. Just put that on the record. But I think we do need to have an honest conversation there. Look, people are thankfully. And it's really good news as a result of everything that's happened, driven, dare I say, actually, by the private sector, with the innovation that has come through in healthcare, but also the ability to produce all sorts of new drugs and so on. People are living longer, and that means that the state pension does need to go up. The question is to what age. I'm not an actuary. I've not looked at the details on this. Well, you say that, sir. I couldn't possibly comment.
I think if you strip out interventions after the global financial crisis from Labour spending, and if you strip out pandemic response from the Conservative spending, Conservatives and or the coalition-led government have spent 4 percentage points higher of GDP than New Labour did. So it's certainly sort of work to be done from the TPA perspective anyway. Lance, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned Liz Truss and not being able to balance the books. I think what she was saying was that you have to balance the books, but in the long term, not necessarily in that year itself. And the problem with the OBR models, their tax models, they're not dynamic. They don't really recognise the growth effects of lower taxes. And, if you go back to George Osborne, every year he dropped the rate of corporation tax, he had increased tax revenues. I think that if we want growth, we have to cut taxes. We have to make this place a place that people want to come and invest, want to come and do business. Look at Ireland, perfect example, 12.5% corporation tax. People only, that's the only reason they invested, or the main reason they invest in Ireland. We should be doing that. I think there's actually a case for completely scrapping corporation tax, actually. I think you'd see enough taxes coming through via dividends, employment, and so on. But we need to think outside the box. But this idea of balancing the books, I think, has been misinterpreted, and I don't even think the media actually understand it.
Yeah, please come in, Kazim.
So I can only comment on the cultural and social phenomena. One thing I've noticed, having spent so much time in the US, is that the British seem to be very obsessed with trying to make everybody equal. And I'm not talking about equal opportunity, which is absolutely something we should strive for. Everybody should have equal opportunity. Everybody should have a fair crack at the whip. But it seems to be an obsession of trying to make everybody equal. And I've seen this in the debate on the grammar schools, that even students from the low social and economic backgrounds, will not reach their full potential. They have to be dumbed down. They have to be made equal. And we see this now on the whole debate around taxing private schools. It seems to be a really bizarre phenomena. And then the whole media had this debate about Rishi Sunak. Does he have an NHS GP or not? Here's the Prime Minister of the country. Do you really want him to go to A&E and line up for 8 hours if there's an emergency? And then the whole thing, did the Prime Minister took a jet up to Scotland when he did his visit to Scotland? This seems, from the outside, this seems just totally bizarre. He is the Prime Minister. He's running the country. The weight of the country is on his shoulders. Do you want him to go and line up at the airport and go through security and the flight's delayed? He's got huge responsibility. But we have this complete obsession of trying to make everybody equal. And there seems to be, unless somebody has the courage in the United Kingdom, that we need fundamental reform of the NHS, we need fundamental reform of the pension system, social care system. And to be absolutely clear, no country has figured this out. But no country is also following the UK model. There's so much better European models out there that we have to look at. This is going to take immense political courage, because the NHS, as I say, is almost like a national religion in the UK. Anybody that touches it becomes politically toxic. But this will require immense political courage, and it's something that has to be done over the long term.
Paul, there was a question earlier from Rob about getting spending down so we can cut taxes and all the rest of it. And then earlier comments were talking about the dynamic returns of reducing taxes. Is that something that you feel could happen in your particular space? Or, do we need the massive spending cuts, or will tax cuts pay for themselves? What's your view on that?
I think in my case, there's a difference between domestic taxes paid, and we talk about international taxpayers here. And international taxpayers can choose where they pay their tax. They can pay it in Britain if they do business or buy things in Britain, or they can do it in France, they can do it in Germany. They can choose where they want to go to. And really, we want to make it so that they choose to come here to do their spending, to do their business, and therefore spend their taxes. One of the downsides of ending the tax-free shopping system here is when you look at the major global brands, they're all looking at their capital expenditure programs for the future. They're downsizing the amount they're going to be spending in the UK, with all the impact that would have on building new stores, employing more people, fitting out those stores, and so on and so forth, because they're saying, actually, the big spending now by the Chinese, by the people from the Gulf states, it's not being done in Britain anymore. It's being done in France, it's being done in Italy. So why should we invest in our stores in London? We should be putting the money into Paris and Milan. It's not science, it's just, where do you put the money? You put the money where the money's being spent. By our tax system here now, we're saying to people, don't come to spend your money in Britain. You can choose where you're going to spend it. Go and spend it somewhere else. That's the message we sent out. And it's picking up more and more and more. And it's not just the fact that those people, they're coming here and they're tourists and spending money. That's great. But it's about where people feel comfortable. And individual people come to Britain, they develop a relationship with Britain. They like to be in Britain. They like to come to Britain. And when they come to invest, they like to invest in Britain. But now they're changing their relationship, and they're going to Paris, and they're liking Paris, and they're choosing their best hotels in Paris, and they're learning how to speak French better and everything. And that's where they're going to be putting their investments in the past. It feels like sort of soft power, but the whole issue about the tourism system, what the West End does for Britain, what London and its theatre and its shopping and its culture does, it attracts people from around the world who want to come here. And then they get that love of Britain, and that's where they say, we want to put our money. They're not doing that now. They're saying, we're going elsewhere.
Okay. Emily?
Yes, I'd like to come back to the second gentleman's question. I do absolutely believe that public sector reform and supply-side reform should have come before any headline tax cuts. Obviously, I'm from the Adam Smith Institute. We love tax cuts. But something that I would like to see more movement on is cutting taxes for those on the lower income tax brackets. And that could either be done by uprating the personal allowance, or it could be done by indexing tax brackets to inflation, which is something I think is really important to do. I'd also like to come back to the question of the state pension and the triple lock. So this morning I was reading a report by the IFS that said that additional spending on public pensions could be between anywhere from 5 billion to 45 billion pounds. And the reason the gap, the margin there is so massive is because of how uncertain planning for the welfare budget, the state pension makes it. So I do think that we need to start looking to reforms to the state pension, and that can either be doing something, some kind of means testing, or that could be through a smooth earnings link. But I do find it manifestly unfair that we're talking about always indexing pensions for everyone by inflation, but we won't do the same for people on benefits, and we won't really do the same for people who work in the public sector. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Let's take another round of questions. That gentleman's hand just towards the back shot up pretty quickly, and then another one here after that, Ben.
Thanks. George Crozier. I work for the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Inheritance tax has been in the news lately. One characterisation of it is as something that penalises success. Another characterisation, which I'll probably hear next week at Labour conference, is that it's an important redistributive measure based on ability to pay. Where do the panel stand on this, and how would you win people over to your side of the argument if it's a major debate at the next election?
Okay, let's pass it forward a couple of rows.
It's Alok Mitra from Watford. Just to put this in context of my own personal situation, just to illustrate a point which I think is, quite universal. I sold my business in 2019, and one of the decisions I looked at was the actual amount of tax I pay collectively, including inheritance tax, and it was more than 100%. So I decided there was no point in working, sell the business and retire, which is what I did. I now have a similar problem with my buy-to-lets. All the regulations and everything else has come in. I've decided every time a tenant leaves, I'm going to sell the property and move out and invest that money in the global stock markets. Problem I have is regulation with the financial sector, whereby if you haven't got a document for, a key document from investment trust, you can't invest in those either. So everywhere you look at, there's always a regulation, and I'm spending my time now to see how I get around those regulations. So, Emily made the point that there are some solutions. I'd like to know what the solutions are, because we know what the problems are. How do we solve them?
Let's actually just take one more while we're at it. There's a gentleman in the front row.
Thank you, Chairman. Jeffrey Brown MP. Following on from Dr. Azim's comments about the National Health Service cost, countries like ours are spending a 4% increase each year on their health service. Our economy is growing at 1.5%. We're going to have to change the model of free at the point of delivery. The trouble is, the first political party that proposes that, it'll be political suicide. How are we going to do it?
Can I just...
Yeah, go.
Yeah, so
in reverse.
like I said, I made it very clear, I think it's going to take immense political courage. I think we will need a Prime Minister, whomsoever it may be, that say, look, I'm willing to be a one-term Prime Minister, and I'll basically make all the difficult decisions. I'll create a royal commission to look at this cross-party and do all the difficult decisions to make sure that the UK is set for the next half century or so. I think a lot of people just don't realise what's happening around the globe. The UK outside of Europe, there's, as I mentioned, the global centres of economic power. I was on a panel just a couple of days ago, what's happening in the Gulf, the GCC. They're investing $7 trillion into their economy. They're going to make it a global logistics and business hub. They are investing more in the youth than any other region in the world. It is only a question of time before the UK risks becoming a remote backwater unless we set the proper infrastructure. All of this stuff will take immense courage, and I'm convinced that you can double the budget of the NHS. Will probably make no difference at all. It's just a huge monster that's completely out of control. I'm not sure why we don't look at a model of, private insurance through employers and let the NHS free up the capacity. Let it be the safety net that was originally designed to be for those that are needed most. But by forcing everybody on it, including our Prime Minister, it's just taking up all that capacity. It just seems really, really strange position to be in.
Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't live in the UK. I live in France, and it's when you live outside the UK and you use the health service. I hate to say it, you realise quite how bad the NHS is. I don't wait for queue. I live in France. I don't queue to see my GP. I get a appointment with him the next day. I've been there 18 years. I've always had the same GP. If I want to go to hospital, when they first said you need to go to hospital, I got my calendar out to look 6 months, 9 months ahead. They said, "Can you do next Wednesday?" And I'm going, "Why aren't there queues, waiting lists?" He said, "Why would you have to wait? You're ill. Why do you need to wait?" They don't have that idea that you have a system where it's built in that it's okay to have to wait for months and months and months. And it's the structure, it's not the staff. When you get to see the NHS, the staff are fantastic, they're brilliant, but they're held back by a structure, and it is the issue, Jeffrey, you said, which is about free to everybody on the point of delivery. That's the sticking point. If you don't, whenever you talk about reforming the NHS, people always say, you want it like America. No, we don't. We don't want it like America. We want it like every other major Western European country that has a fantastic system, because the French, for example, put in the same amount of GDP as a government into their health system as the British do. But they then, because they have a system where if you're earning, you pay a little bit of that, the French state doesn't pay all of it, you will take out an insurance policy. That insurance policy, taken widely, isn't used to pay the private sector like Bupa. It all goes back into the health service, and it accounts for nearly 4% of GDP. So in France, they don't just get what the government gives them, they get half as much again, and we don't really get them. My insurance is about £100, €100 a month. It's not a lot of money, but the health service is fantastic, and it's good for the patients, and it's good for the staff. But we can't have that discussion here in the UK because the NHS is seen like a religion. You only have to go abroad and realise how awful it is.
Emily, some closing thoughts from you. We've got IHT, we've got solutions, we've got NHS.
So I think I'd like to start by coming in on inheritance tax. The Adam Smith Institute actually has been stating that this is a distortionary and damaging tax since the 1990s. So I think our position on it is pretty clear. The main argument that I'd make is that you asked how we persuade the public into scrapping inheritance tax. And actually, if you look at some recent studies, inheritance tax is seen as the most unfair tax in the United Kingdom. Even though I think it's only 4% of people are likely to pay inheritance tax, it's already seen as an incredibly unpopular tax. So I don't think that that's the issue.
Okay. Lance, part of the problem with inheritance tax is that the very rich don't pay it. And it's very complicated. There's all sorts of different loopholes. Is simplifying it more important than scrapping it, or?
I just think the best form of simplification is scrapping it, actually. You're absolutely right. The very rich don't pay it. They set up trusts or do whatever. The very poor obviously don't pay it because they just don't have the resources. So it's people sort of stuck in the middle that end up having to pay it. And what I find odd is that, we've had a society that's, not necessarily in recent years, but certainly a few decades ago was encouraging home ownership, encouraging people to own their own homes and take responsibility, and then we clobber them at the end of it. What is the point? I think it is unfair. I've seen some of those polls. I think people do feel it's unfair. It comes at obviously a very difficult time for families, yeah, I think it's one of the few policies that I think that will help the Tories at the next election. So they should definitely be pushing it.
And last but not least, Ranald, why don't you wrap us up with some closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so look, on inheritance tax, let me deal with that one. We've got to do, I think, a full overhaul of our tax system. It's far too complicated. It's far too high, and it's not popular to have measures like this either. So it's not as if everyone's willing us on. I think every income decile across this country, in fact, agrees with us that it should be abolished. It's not just people who will pay it; it's every single income decile. Why? Because they do believe that their children will be more successful than them. And they want their children to be able to pass it on to their grandchildren. And that brings us back to that idea of success. We should be celebrating it. We should be encouraging more people to take those risks to then reap the rewards in the future. And in the in the abolition of inheritance tax. As a good European, I'd look to Sweden as an example, where they actually grew the economy as a result of abolishing their equivalent of inheritance tax. So it's proven that not only can you be fairer to people, actually deliver what people want, but you can actually grow the economy in doing that. It raised £7.1 billion last year. That's less than 1% of all exchequer revenue. Relatively speaking, it's a small tax. And if we abolish it, I think it's sending a very clear signal that we're the party that believes in being able to pass on the proceeds of a lifetime's work to the next generation, whilst the other lot will want to take everything that they possibly can. And that's the sort of stuff that helps us win the next election.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We've covered quite a lot there. American culture, inheritance tax, sports day. We had it all. So thank you very much to our panel for such a lively and interesting discussion, and mostly thank you all for joining us this afternoon, but please join me in thanking the panel.